1973 would represent the last of an era for the Buick Riviera. That was a very brief, let's say, period in the Riviera's history from 1971 to 1973, where the Riviera would have a distinctive so-called boat-tail styling. And as the 1973 Riviera was introduced, it would come with styling that was somewhat blunted versus the 1971 and 72 models, in large part due to the bumper standards in the front, the 5-mile-an-hour bumper standard in the front. Notice this large impact-style bumper that, of course, kind of blunted the plan view associated with the styling. And also out back, there was a 2.5-mile-per-hour impact standard, which necessitated the rub strip that you'll see out back. But let's talk about and walk around this particular 17,000-mile 1973 Boattail Riviera and tell you a little bit about the Riviera's history. Now, those who are classic car fans will know that the Riviera was introduced in 1963, and the first generation would continue from 1963 through 1965. And the interesting part about the beautiful 63 to 65 Riviera is that it actually was never intended to be a Buick in the first place. Buick Division simply won out on the selection of a General Motors styling exercise because it agreed to put the car into production largely unaltered. In a number of concepts, the 63 Riviera, before it was deemed a Buick, was actually labeled a LaSalle, and hence those kind of fine linear-like forms on either side of the fronts of the fenders that was meant to emulate the last LaSalles. But it didn't really matter. The car was absolutely gorgeous, and at this point in time, various General Motors divisions were getting jealous of the success of the four-place Thunderbird that Ford had introduced for the 1958 model year and wanted something similar of their own. And so Buick was really the first of the GM divisions to get its personal luxury coupe, the 63 Riviera. Of course, in a number of years after that, the other divisions would follow. In particular, Oldsmobile would follow with its Tornado in 1966, Cadillac would follow with its Eldorado in 1967, and the second generation Riviera would be introduced for the 1966 model year. Pontiac, I guess you could also call the Grand Prix a little bit of a response to that Thunderbird, although the Grand Prix was meant to be a more sporty automobile, hence the Grand Prix nameplate, and that was introduced for the 1962 model year. Regardless, as I mentioned, that first-generation Riviera would last from 1963 to 65, the 65 being arguably the most beautiful of all because it has the hidden headlamps that are disguised beneath clamshell headlamp covers in those grills at the ends of the fenders. Then for 1966, an all-new second-generation Riviera would be introduced, this one on a shared E-body platform, together with that 66 Tornado and soon-to-be-introduced 1967 Eldorado. That generation would last all the way through 1970, and then in 1971, the all-new Boattail Riviera would debut. Now, the Boattail Riviera was really the brainchild of General Motors styling vice president Bill Mitchell, who enjoyed that kind of classic Boattail-like form inspired by, well, true classic cars like the Auburn Boattail Speedster, which, interestingly, many people think it was an expensive car back when it was produced. Auburn was actually a lower-priced brand, kind of comparable to Buicks of the day, but they certainly produced gorgeous cars. Regardless, Bill Mitchell loved that Boattail-like shape, and a number of vehicles displayed it from General Motors, one of which being the 1963 Stingray Corvette that had this beautiful tapered shape and 4 fender bumps on each of the fenders and quarter panels that really formed the overall shape of that particular car, coupled with, I would say, a datum line that runs around the entire vehicle. The Boattail would also grace the refresh of the Grand Prix in 1971. And notice here, it's not really a full boat tail, but if you extended those shoulders backward, it would become a boat tail. And you could even say that the, let's say, 1970s Eldorados, like the 1976 Eldorado up back, had a little bit of that form as well. Again, not a pure boat tail because you'd have to extend those shoulders out quite a ways beyond where they are to get that form. But the Boattail, nonetheless, was introduced for 1971, and let's just say that dealers were not happy that the Riviera had gone from the beautiful 1966 to 70 generation that was a huge sales success, selling about 45 to 50,000 units when the Oldsmobile Tornado and Cadillac Eldorado were selling about half of that in each model year or less. So Buick division was extremely happy with that second generation Riviera. And then imagine you go from that and you're now designated the recipient of this vehicle that is just not in keeping with anything before it. The 71 to 73 Riviera was not something that could be defined as sporty elegance. The car had grown too large by this point. It shared numerous components with General Motors' full-size vehicles, including the A-pillar, the windshield, the front glass, and it really had lost some of that litheness that I was just describing as it grew much larger. Now, the interesting thing about the Boattail Riviera was that it was never meant to be this big in the first place. In fact, a number of advanced styling exercises, like you see here in this picture, had the car on a smaller body, like the A-body intermediates. And I think it was a much more beautiful form overall. And it's a shame that the division and General Motors pushed to place the car on the B body because I think it lost something as it gained size. And the same could be said of the 71 Tornado, which also went to that full-size platform, and the 71 Eldorado. But the Boattail perhaps was the one that deviated the most from the original advanced styling exercise that you see here, which I think was beyond gorgeous. Regardless, let's walk around this particular 1973 Riviera and talk a little bit more about the details. First, as we rotate around to the front three-quarter kind of side view here, let's discuss some of the Boattail forms here. As I mentioned, this car shared the A-pillars, the front glass, the windshield with the full-size General Motors vehicles, but it certainly has a distinctive shape all its own. And a couple things about that shape. Notice the distinctive sweep spear-like styling here and how far inboard the C-pillar is versus the quarter panel. So you consequently get this very large surface that you see in between the C-pillar and the outermost portion of the quarter panel. And you have that line that really starts at the front of the fender, and as it continues rearward, it starts dipping down before having that distinctive sweep spear-like kick-up just ahead of the rear wheel. One other thing I will note here is that the fender kind of blends seamlessly and beautifully into the door. It fades out partway through and gives the car this beautiful reflection on that door. By the way, the door handle on these Rivieras was borrowed from the 1969 Grand Prix. The Tornado would also employ this door handle, while for whatever reason the Cadillac Eldorado would just use a conventional door handle. This car, notice that it really doesn't have any wheel flares at all, so to speak. The wheels arches are just trimmed with stainless trim, and I suspect that was because there really wasn't much room on the body surface to do that. If you wanted that surface that you see that starts at the front of the fender and continues into the door, and you also want to have that sweep spear out back, there just really isn't a place for a pronounced wheel arch. And that is despite the fact that, for example, the second generation Riviera I thought had some beautiful wheel arches, but this is what it is. I'll also point out that when Buick de-boat-tailed the Riviera in 1974, they interestingly employed the same front end sheet metal for the fenders. And of course, that meant that they had to blend that form into the door and continue that on into the quarter panel, despite trying to de-boat-tail the Riviera overall. Now here, as we rotate around to the driver's side, you can actually see even better how big that bumper is on these 73s. My goodness, it's huge, and why it kind of blunted the pointy nose nature of the Riviera. You couldn't have that bumper sticking out much further in the midsection of the car. You also have lamps in either of the fender tops to let you know that your turn signals are working, a nice feature. And well, the 73 Riviera, I think the 73 is the least pretty of the 71, 2, and 3, particularly given the front end change, but still a good-looking car. Now, out back, we have still the Boattail-like form with that Boattail backlight. Boy, that had to have been a very expensive piece of glass for the rear window. But clearly, the midsection here is relatively blunted, again, because of those impact standards that were in place in 1973, the 2.5-mile-an-hour standard in the rear. And so if you compare this particular rear end with the 1971 Riviera, you'll notice that it just doesn't have as distinctive of a point. And for that reason, that's why collectors tend to prize the 1971 model in particular. 1972s are also relatively collectible. And the 73s are collectible, but not nearly as much as the 71 and 72s. Notice that rub strip in the middle of the bumper, as well as kind of like these bumper guards surrounding the license plate frame. You can also see the massive shoulders here formed by the Boattail-like shape and how wide this car looks as a consequence. Well, it is wide. It's 80 inches wide. It's actually the widest that it could be without putting oversized marker lights on the vehicle. So these full-size General Motors vehicles from 1971 to 1976 are just enormously massive. And I guess that's one of the things that makes them so cool. Now, as you rotate around to the interior, we'll notice that this is obviously a hardtop vehicle. There's no B-pillar. There is an interesting kind of cutout there for the rear glass, and the daylight opening is dictated by that sweep spear that we previously mentioned. This particular vehicle has the optional center console with the really cool shifter there. And as we see in another photo here, what's interesting to me is that by 1973, the Riviera still had this very driver-centric cockpit that you can see that was emblematic of really almost all of the General Motors instrument panels in 1973, except for Chevrolet. Everybody else had that kind of driver-centric theme. Not sure if that was just a passing fad or what it was, but that was what the divisions went with. Another interesting bit of trivia is notice the headrests on this Riviera. And you're going to say, well, what about the headrest is so unique? Well, those are actually borrowed from Cadillac. They're like a somewhat hard, somewhat soft plastic, kind of horrible design, but that's what Cadillac employed, and Buick, I guess, decided to rob it here for use on their seats. And here we have another view of a similar 1973 Riviera with that full-length center console. And one thing that I will point out is that the IP by this point was commonized with the other full-size Buicks. And in 1971 and 72, the Riviera had kind of a dual cockpit theme where the passenger side had a shape that was similar to the driver's side. But I suspect for cost reasons, Buick elected to just drop that instrument panel and perhaps thought that it wasn't that big of a differentiator and went with the common panel from the other full-size Buicks. Note that in 1974, Buick and the other General Motors divisions would revise their interiors completely. So it is kind of curious they wouldn't wait that extra year in order to change their instrument panel. I guess they really needed those cost savings, let's say, quickly. I do have to say that I love the Buick supersized accelerator and brake pedal in these particular model years. Buick and Oldsmobile had some great accelerator and brake pedals, better than some of the other GM divisions. This is also an air conditioning equipped car. The red car that we were looking at before was not, but you can notice the crotch cooler vents here in the dash. Now, under hood, we have Buick's 455 cubic inch V8. The Buick 455 was an engine that didn't run for very long, only 1970 through 1976. It was based on the 430 cubic inch V8 that was first introduced as an all-new engine for the 1967 model year. By this point, the Buick 455 in the Riviera was making 250 net horsepower through dual exhaust. Not a bad number in 1973 overall. And there was still, in 1973, an optional Stage 1 455 that made 260 net horsepower. Some would say that that was underrated, but that would be the last year for the Stage 1 Buick V8 for 1973, and it's a very rare option if you see one in a Riviera. This one obviously does not have air conditioning. There's no air conditioning compressor, no evaporator, etc. under hood. One other thing I will point out is that Buick was the only division that had kind of these funky white fan shrouds and bolt-ons for the coolant overflow bottle. I don't know why the other GM divisions didn't do this or why Buick wanted to do that specifically and have this molded in color, which the color was white, but they did. And it's kind of a curious tidbit for the Riviera and for other Buicks of this time frame. You can also see the significant amount of bracing under hood here from the cowl to the wheel wells to the radiator support. And I think what Buick was trying to do was quell a GM chassis on these full-size cars that was a bit, let's just call it less than rigid. And so each division had their own strategy for how to attenuate those particular issues. But Buick went with these 4 different braces to try to make the body a bit more rigid than it really was. And last but not least, we'll take a little look at the trunk here and look at the pathway that trunk seal takes with this interesting opening dictated by the Boattail shape. Pretty atypical for GM during that time frame. Normally these deck lids and trunk seals just were kind of a square shape, or I shouldn't say square, but rectangle. Here this one has a number of jogs and turns associated with the styling, but Buick made it work. So what do you think of this 73 Boattail Riviera, and what about how it compares to the 71 to 72 in your mind? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.